The city never sleeps when Gideon Vall is awake that he owns the shadows, the restaurants, the docks, the back alleys where deals are made in silence. Nobody looks him in the eye for too long. Nobody knocks on his car window. Ever, but one cold Tuesday night, after Gideon finished his usual dinner at the Velthorn and stepped toward his armored black SUV, something strange happened that a boy appeared. Thin, dirty, barefoot. No older than 10 that he pressed his small hand flat against the tinted glass and waited. Security moved fast. They always do. 2 men stepped in, arms wide, ready to push the boy away, but then the boy spoke, just a whisper. Barely loud enough to reach past the glass, Gideon held up one hand, the guards froze. He leaned forward. Listened, and then, slowly, the most feared man in the city opened the car door and stepped out onto the pavement. No one standing nearby could hear what the boy said. No one could understand why a child's whisper would move a man like Gideon Vall, but before the sun rose again, that single whisper would shake the walls of his entire organization, and reveal a betrayal that no one saw coming. This is the story of the night a homeless boy knocked on a Mafia boss's car window, and changed everything. The night was cold enough to see your breath. Gideon Vall straightened his coat and nodded to his driver. Dinner was done. Business was done. Time to go. The Velthorn restaurant sat on the corner of 5th and Harrow Street, glowing warmly from inside, like nothing dark ever happened there. Outside, 3 black SUVs idled at the curb. 6 guards stood in position. Nobody walked past without being watched. Gideon was 44 years old. Broad shoulders. Short silver hair at the temples. Eyes the color of cold concrete. Men twice his size crossed the street to avoid him. That was just how life worked in this city. He was halfway to the car when the boy appeared from behind a trash can. The boy was small. Maybe 9 or 10. His jacket was torn at the sleeve and his shoes had no laces. His face was dirty but his eyes were sharp, desperate and wide and completely focused on Gideon. One of the guards moved instantly, stepping between the child and the boss. Back away, kid. But the boy didn't run. He stepped sideways, pressed both hands against the cold glass of the SUV, and looked straight at the tinted window. Like he knew Gideon was watching. Then the boy leaned close, and whispered. The sound barely reached the glass. But Gideon heard it. He raised one hand slowly. The guard stopped. The whole street went quiet. Gideon stepped forward himself, moved the guard aside with a single look, and bent down toward the boy. Say that again, he said quietly. The boy's name was Teo. He said it quick, like he was afraid the moment would vanish if he wasted a single second. His voice shook, but his eyes held steady. He told Gideon that his sister had been taken 2 nights ago, right off the street near the fish market on Callum Road. 3 men grabbed her, shoved her into a white van, and drove east before anyone could shout. Teo had chased the van on foot. He ran until his lungs gave out and the van disappeared into the dark, but he kept moving. Kept watching. And then he heard something that changed everything. He had hidden behind a wall near the docks when one of the men made a phone call. The man spoke quickly, but Teo heard it clearly. The boss's people know about this location. Vall's network runs through here. We're covered. Teo looked up at Gideon and repeated the words slowly, the same ones he had whispered through the glass. The men who took my sister said your name. The air between them went still. Gideon straightened up slowly. He had built his organization on one rule above all others: what happened in his city happened with his knowledge. Nobody moved without him knowing. Nobody used his name without permission. If someone was stealing children and using the Vall name as cover, that was not just a crime. It was a direct insult. He looked at Teo for a long moment. Then he said, "Get in the car." Brax, Gideon's most trusted enforcer, was waiting at the private office on Kellner Street when they arrived. He took one look at the boy and crossed his arms. "Boss," he said quietly, "we don't know this kid." "I know," Gideon replied. "That's why we're here." Brax wasn't being cruel. He was being careful. That was his job. In this business, a crying child on the street could just as easily be bait as a victim. He had seen both. Teo sat in the chair across from the desk without being told to. He reached into the inside of his torn jacket and pulled out something small, wrapped in a piece of rag. He set it on the desk and pulled the rag away. It was a cufflink. Silver. Heavy. Shaped like a narrow blade with a letter pressed into the flat side, the letter C. Gideon leaned forward. His jaw tightened. Brax moved closer and looked at the cufflink without touching it. "Where did you get this?" Gideon asked. Teo explained that one of the men had grabbed him by the jacket near the docks before he escaped. They had pulled at his collar and the man's sleeve had caught. The cufflink had torn free and fallen into Teo's hand as he ran. Brax looked at Gideon. Neither man spoke, because both of them recognized the cufflink immediately. The initial. The design. The weight of it belonged to Corso, one of Gideon's own lieutenants. Gideon didn't shout. He never did. The men who shouted were the ones who had already lost control. Gideon had built everything he had by staying very, very calm. He placed the cufflink in his coat pocket and looked at Teo. "You sleep here tonight," he said. "Brax will make sure you're safe." Teo started to argue. He wanted to look for his sister now. "Tonight," Gideon cut him off gently. "We will find her. But if we move wrong, they'll move her first. Understand?" The boy looked at him hard. Then nodded. Gideon left the room and made 3 phone calls. By midnight, 12 of his most trusted men were seated around a long table in the basement meeting room on Kellner Street. He told them only this: someone inside the organization was using the Vol name to run operations without his approval. Something involving children. He told them the rule had not changed. Children were untouchable in his territory. That had always been the rule. Anyone who crossed it would answer to him personally. He looked at each face around the table one by one. "Nobody moves on this yet," he said. "Not one of you. I want the operation mapped first. I want to know who, where, and how deep this goes before we touch anything." The men nodded without question. What none of them knew, not even Brax, was that Gideon had already secretly placed 2 shadow men to watch each lieutenant's movements. Starting immediately. Starting with Corso, the warehouse sat at the far end of Decker Lane, behind a meat processing plant that hadn't been running in 2 years. The building looked empty from outside. Broken windows. Rusted gate. Weeds growing through the cracks in the yard, but Gideon's shadow men had followed a van connected to Corso to this exact location 3 times in the past 36 hours. Gideon sent Brax in first, alone, dressed like a dock worker. No weapons. Just eyes. Brax came back 2 hours later. He closed the door to the office and spoke low. "It's being used as a sorting point. People in, people out. Different vehicles each time. Whoever's running this knows how to keep it quiet. No noise, no lights, nothing that draws attention." "How many people on site?" Gideon asked. "Maybe 10 inside. Armed, but relaxed. They're not expecting company." Gideon nodded. He was about to speak again when Teo stepped forward from the corner of the room. The boy had been sitting quietly on the floor all morning, listening to everything. "I've seen that building," Teo said. Everyone turned. He pointed at the rough sketch Brax had drawn on the table. "The white van passed that building the night they took Lila. I remember the broken gate. I thought about hiding inside, but the light scared me." Gideon looked at Brax. Then back at Teo. The boy reached forward and pointed to a small mark on the sketch. "There," he said quietly. "That's where the van stopped." Gideon ordered a full sweep of everything connected to Decker Lane. Phone records. Vehicle logs. Any name that passed through his network and touched that location. By the next morning, his men had pulled documents from an abandoned office near the warehouse. Delivery receipts, coded lists, and a set of handwritten notes that took 2 hours to work through. What they found changed the shape of everything. Lila had not been taken by accident, she had been specifically chosen. The notes contained a short description of her age, her appearance, the street she lived on, and the time she usually walked home from the market each week. Somebody had been watching her. Planning. Waiting for the right moment, Gideon spread the papers across the desk and read every word twice. "Why this girl?" Brax asked. "She's a child from the fish market." "Nobody." Gideon tapped one line near the bottom of the page. "She's not nobody," he said quietly. The notes contained one final detail. 2 weeks earlier, Lila had been near the old fuel yard on Pett Street when a confrontation broke out between two of the traffickers. She had seen the faces clearly. She had witnessed something she was never supposed to see, a handoff, a transaction, names being exchanged in the open. They had taken her to keep her quiet. She was a witness. Gideon leaned back in his chair. Someone was running a much larger operation than he had realized, and it had been growing quietly inside his own territory for months. Gideon called Teo into the main room and sat across from him. No guards. No Brax. Just the two of them. "Tell me how you found me," he said. Teo answered without hesitating. After the white van disappeared near the docks, he hadn't gone home or gone to the police. He had followed on foot, sticking to back alleys and side streets, watching from a distance. When the van finally stopped at a building near Talner Creek, Teo hid behind a wire fence and watched until he understood the pattern. When guards changed, which doors were used, which vehicles came and went, that he followed that pattern for 6 hours before the men noticed him. When one of them came close, Teo ran. But not before he overheard two of them arguing outside. One said the Talner Creek location was becoming a problem. He mentioned moving everything to a larger site further east, somewhere bigger that their partners in Vol's network had already prepared. That was when Teo understood who to go to. He spent the next day finding out where Gideon ate dinner. It wasn't hard. People talked. Even in dangerous neighborhoods, people said the boss's name when they thought no one was listening. "You followed armed men for 6 hours, Gideon said slowly. Alone. A 10-year-old boy." Teo shrugged. "She's my sister." Gideon was quiet for a long moment, then he said, "The building they mentioned near Talner Creek, can you describe it?" Teo nodded and reached for a pen. Based on Teo's description, Gideon had the Talner Creek site identified by noon. A converted grain storage building. Large. Old. Surrounded on 3 sides by water. He gathered his team. The plan was straightforward: hit the building hard, move fast, and pull everyone out before the traffickers had time to react. Gideon had run dozens of operations like this. Clean, quick, controlled. He was ready to give the order. Then Teo spoke from the back of the room. "They'll know you're coming." Gideon turned. The room went quiet. Teo stood near the doorway, arms folded, looking smaller than ever, but absolutely certain. "I watched them for hours," he said. "They move the people inside if anything unusual happens outside. A loud car. A stranger on the street. They move them fast, before you can reach the door." Brax looked at Gideon. "He's not wrong. We've seen that response pattern before. So if we go in loud," Gideon said slowly. "They'll move Lila before you find her," Teo finished. Gideon looked at the boy for a long moment. This 10-year-old, barefoot and hungry, had just stopped a raid that could have failed before it started. He canceled the immediate order. He told his men to hold their positions and maintain quiet surveillance only. No approach. No movement. No noise. The mission had just become more patient. More careful, and somewhere inside a cold building near Talner Creek, it had also become more urgent. The surveillance team on the Talner Creek building worked in shifts through the night. 2 men at a time, positioned at opposite ends of the waterway. No radios, just hand signals and a check-in code every hour. At a 2:15 in the morning, on the second night of watching, one of the observers sent an alert. A vehicle had arrived at the building's rear entrance. No headlights. Moving slow. When the shadow men relayed the vehicle's description back to Kellner Street, Gideon recognized it immediately. A dark green truck with a dented rear panel and a custom roof rack. He had seen that truck parked outside Corso's private garage on multiple occasions. Brax confirmed it within the hour after pulling the plate. The truck was registered to a holding company. Officially, it had no connection to Corso. But unofficially, Gideon knew exactly whose vehicle it was. That he looked at the cufflinks still sitting on his desk, then at the report in his hand that he had suspected Corso from the beginning. But suspicion was not the same as confirmation. In his world, you did not act on suspicion. You acted on proof. And proof had to be iron solid before you moved on one of your own men. That he needed Corso caught in the act, not just near it. That he called his surveillance team back from the site before dawn. Tomorrow afternoon, he would set a trap, not at the grain building. Not at the warehouse on Decker Lane. The trap would be set inside his own organization. Gideon met with each of his 4 lieutenants separately over the course of one afternoon. Normal meetings. Nothing unusual. He discussed supply routes, territory boundaries, upcoming collections, standard business, but to each lieutenant, he quietly mentioned one different piece of information, described as confidential and time-sensitive. The first, he mentioned a new weapons cache on the East Bridge Road. The second, he said a key witness in an old case had just been located in the Burroughs District. The third, he mentioned a rival had offered to buy part of the harbor territory, and to Corso, Gideon mentioned something very specific. He said there was going to be a surprise inspection of all water-connected operations starting the next morning, beginning at Tallner Creek. That he delivered each piece of information calmly. Naturally. The kind of thing a boss tells a trusted lieutenant. Then he waited. By 7 o'clock that evening, one of Gideon's shadow men reported back. An unknown number had sent 3 short-coded messages from a burner phone traced near Corso's apartment. The recipients began moving vehicles away from the Tallner Creek building within the hour. None of the other 3 locations showed any unusual activity, only Tallner Creek, only the detail given to Corso. Gideon sat back in his chair and closed his eyes for just a moment. There it was. Clean and clear as a signature on paper. The traitor had confirmed himself without knowing it. That night, after his men had gone home and the building on Kellner Street was nearly empty, Gideon walked down the corridor toward the back room where Teo had been sleeping. That he expected the boy to be asleep. But as he pushed the door open slightly, he saw Teo sitting on the floor with his back against the wall. His knees were pulled to his chest. His eyes were open, staring at nothing. That he wasn't crying. But his face held the kind of quiet that only comes after too many hours of trying to be strong. Gideon stepped inside and sat on the floor beside him. Not in a chair. On the floor. He didn't speak for a moment, then he said, "I grew up in a place worse than where you're sleeping now." Teo looked at him sideways but said nothing. "Not much older than you," Gideon continued. "No parents. No food most days. Nobody to go to when things went wrong." He paused. "Back then, I thought the only way to survive was to take what you needed and trust no one." Teo was quiet for a while. Then he asked, "Did it work?" Gideon looked at the wall and gave a small, humorless laugh. "It kept me alive," he said. He didn't say anything else after that. But he sat with the boy until Teo's eyes slowly closed and his breathing steadied into sleep. Then Gideon stood, turned off the hallway light, and walked back to his office. Something had shifted inside him. He knew it. This mission had stopped being just business a long time ago. The next morning, over bread and hot tea brought by one of the men, Gideon asked the question that had been sitting in the back of his mind since that first night. "Why me?" he said. "You live in this city. You know what I am. Why would a boy like you believe I would help?" Teo tore a piece of bread slowly and chewed before answering. "About 4 months earlier," he said, he had been watching from the alley behind the Callum Road Market. A woman with 2 small children had been arguing with the stall owner. She had no money. 3 days without food. The stall owner told her to leave. A man standing nearby, tall, silver at the temples, wearing a dark coat, had walked over without a word. He paid the full amount himself and told the stall owner to let her take double what she needed. Then the man walked away without looking back. No acknowledgement. No conversation. Like it had never happened. Teo had recognized him from the whispers on the street that it was Gideon Vall. Gideon said nothing. His expression didn't change. "Nobody saw that," he said quietly. "It wasn't a question." "I saw it," Teo replied simply. The room was still. Then Teo's cracked old phone buzzed once on the table. He picked it up and his face changed immediately. They're moving tonight, he said, holding the screen toward Gideon. A message from a neighbor near the docks, someone Teo had asked to keep watch. I told her to message me if she saw the van again. Tonight. It had to be tonight. Gideon mobilized his crew within the hour. 8 vehicles. 22 men. Brax leading from the front, they tracked the convoy from a distance, 3 vehicles moving in a loose formation east of the city, past the docks, past Tallner Creek, heading toward open land beyond the old cement factory on Haraway Road. Gideon watched from a tablet in the back seat as his shadow team relayed positions every 4 minutes. The convoy turned off the main road onto an unpaved track, then through a gate, then disappeared behind a long line of tall trees. His lead team confirmed the location 20 minutes later. A private compound. A wide single-floor building behind a wire perimeter. Generator lighting. 2 guard posts visible. 4 vehicles already parked inside. A structure large enough to hold a significant number of people. This was not just a holding location. This was the main site. Gideon looked at Teo, who had refused to stay behind and sat in the rear of the vehicle, small and still, his eyes fixed on the tablet screen. Then Teo gripped Gideon's arm without warning. "Stop," he said. Gideon looked at the screen. The shadow team's feed showed a slow pan across the compound yard, and there, being moved between 2 vehicles by a pair of men, was a girl. Small. Dark hair. Bare feet. Teo's voice broke at the edges. "That's Lila." Gideon placed one steady hand on the boy's shoulder, then he turned to Brax. "Get everyone in position." The operation was precisely mapped. 3 entry points. A clear signal system. Teo was to remain in the vehicle with 2 guards. No arguments accepted. Brax led the first team toward the northern side of the compound. Gideon took the second team in from the east through a gap in the wire perimeter his shadow team had already identified. They moved in complete silence. Dark clothing. No talking. Gideon's team was 30 meters from the building when Brax's voice crackled once in his earpiece. The abort signal. Gideon froze, then he heard it. Footsteps. Deliberate. Coming from behind it. He turned slowly. 4 men had fanned out in a loose arc behind his position. They were not compound guards. They were dressed like city men. Professional, and standing at the center, holding a phone at his side like he had all the time in the world, was Corso. He looked relaxed. "Certain. I knew you'd find this place eventually," Corso said. "I just didn't expect so few men." Gideon stood very still. "You fed yourself the wrong information," Corso said. "Smart. But I've been 3 steps ahead of this for 2 days." Gideon looked at him without expression. "You turned on your own people," Gideon said. "I built a better arrangement," Corso replied. "Nothing personal." One of Corso's men raised a weapon, then the entire tree line erupted with movement. Gideon's full reserve team, 30 men, closing in fast from 3 sides at once. The night split open with the sound of it was fast. It was loud. And it was over in less than 4 minutes. Corso's 4 men were outnumbered before they could reposition. Gideon's reserve team moved with discipline. They had trained for exactly this kind of sudden reversal. 2 of Corso's men were disarmed immediately. One tried to run and was caught at the perimeter gate. The 4th fought back hard and was put down in the gravel. Corso himself bolted toward the compound wall when the first shots fired. He made it 10 meters before 2 of Gideon's men caught him from either side and forced him to his knees in the dirt. Gideon walked over slowly. The noise had stopped. The compound was fully surrounded. He stood above Corso and looked down without raising his voice. "You used my name to run a trafficking operation in my territory," he said. "You kidnapped children. You ordered a 10-year-old girl taken because she saw something she wasn't supposed to see." Corso looked up, face dirty, lip bleeding, eyes still hard. "This city was going to change with or without you. I saw the money and I took the position. That's all it was." "A position," Gideon said quietly. "Don't pretend you're any different from me," Corso said. Gideon took one slow breath. "I'm not pretending," he said. Then he gave a single, quiet nod to Brax. What happened next in that open field was final and absolute. Corso would not be walking back from the compound tonight. Gideon turned toward the building. Find the girl. The compound guards had heard the commotion outside but weren't prepared for what came through their doors. Gideon's teams breached the main building from 3 entrances at the same moment. Controlled and fast. They moved room by room, neutralizing resistance with discipline, keeping the operation tight and clean. What they found inside was worse than Gideon had expected. There were 11 people in the main hall. Most were young, teenagers, some younger. A few sat against the walls. Some lay on thin mats on the floor. Several looked up when the doors crashed open, blinking slowly into the sudden light. Gideon's men moved through them quickly, speaking calmly, telling each one they were safe and to follow without panic. Brax organized the evacuation while the other teams cleared the south corridor, for smaller rooms that held more people. More faces. More names nobody had written down. 17 total were pulled from the building in 12 minutes, then Gideon's man came out of the final room in the south corridor and shook his head. She's not here. Gideon didn't stop moving. He turned toward the eastern side of the building where 2 rooms were still unchecked, off the main layout, not on any plan they had been working from. Brax's voice came through the earpiece from outside. Boss, there's a second structure. Small building behind the generator block. We almost walked right past it. Gideon changed direction without a single word. He moved toward it fast. The second structure was barely larger than a storage shed. It sat behind the generator block with no windows and a heavy padlocked door. If Brax hadn't spotted the thin line of light running beneath it, they might have passed it completely. One of Gideon's men cut through the padlock in under a minute. Gideon pushed the door open. The room inside was small and dim. A single battery lamp on the floor threw a weak yellow glow against bare walls. A bucket in the corner. A thin blanket folded on the ground. And a girl pressed into the far corner with her knees pulled tight to her chest. She flinched when the door opened. Her eyes were wide and red. Her face was pale and drawn. But she was breathing. She was alive. Her hair was dark. Her face was small. She was wearing a yellow shirt with a tear at the shoulder. Gideon recognized the shirt from the pencil sketch Teo had made days earlier. He knelt down slowly so he wasn't towering above her. You're Lila, he said, keeping his voice as gentle as he knew how. Your brother sent me. She stared at him for a long moment, searching his face, then her expression crumpled completely. Teo, she whispered. He's outside, Gideon said. Right outside. He never stopped looking for you. One of the female team members stepped in beside Gideon, crouched low, and held out a hand. Lila looked at it for 1 second, then took it. They got her to her feet. They moved, then the fire alarm pierced the building from somewhere inside. The generator lamp had been knocked during the operation. Smoke was already filling the eastern corridor. The building was beginning to burn. Smoke moved faster than anyone expected. The old compound walls were dry wood and the fire caught quickly, sending thick black clouds rolling down the south corridor. Gideon's men had trained for fire. Move forward, not back. Find the exit. Keep the people moving. Brax led the first group, the 17 from the main hall, out through the eastern breach point in under 2 minutes. The second team guided the rest from the side rooms. Gideon's rearguard held the exit points open as long as possible, calling out headcounts as they moved. Gideon came out last, walking quickly with Lila and the female team member beside him. He stepped into the cool open air, turned once to look at the building, and counted all of his men. All of the people they had come for, nobody left behind. Brax was already on the radio, coordinating the vehicles waiting at the tree line. The evacuees were being moved fast and calm, guided away from the heat and the smoke. Then, from the edge of the vehicle lights, a small figure broke free and came running. Teo had heard the alarm and torn away from his 2 guards the moment the noise started. He crossed the open yard at a dead sprint, sliding on the loose gravel as he stopped in front of Gideon. He looked past the boss, and saw her. Lila saw him at the same moment. They ran the last few steps together and held on with everything they had, neither one intending to let go. Gideon stood still and watched them. His face didn't move, but something in his chest felt different. Looser. Lighter.I in the distance, the first police sirens rose and began to grow. Gideon moved with purpose that he had 4 minutes before the first police units reached the compound road. Instructions came fast and low. His men dispersed in practiced order, vehicles pulling out along separate routes, no clusters, no patterns. The people rescued from inside were transferred to 2 unmarked vans driven by men Gideon trusted with everything that he pulled Brax aside. The children go to the house on Veldon Street, he said. Warm, fed, quiet. No questions tonight. Brax nodded. After that, proper documentation arranged for everyone. Housing assistance. Medical care for all of them within the week. School enrollment where it applies. He paused. Use the foundation account. Brax raised one eyebrow but said nothing further. He knew better than to ask questions when the boss spoke in that particular tone, low and steady and completely decided. Teo and Lila were already inside one of the vans. Lila had her face pressed against her brother's shoulder, eyes closed. Teo held her hand and stared out the rear window as the burning compound slowly disappeared behind the tree line. Before the van door closed, Teo reached into his jacket pocket. He pulled something out, pressed it into the hand of the guard beside him, and quietly asked him to pass it to the boss. The guard crossed to Gideon and held it out. Gideon took it. It was a small folded piece of paper. Torn from the edge of something. Rough at the corners that he put it in his coat pocket without looking at it. Then he walked to his car, stepped in as the sirens drew close, and pulled the door shut quietly behind him. 3 months later, the Velthorn restaurant was still the last stop on Gideon Vall's Tuesday evenings. Same table. Same driver waiting at the curb. Same city turning slowly under the same dark sky, but small things had changed. The compound on Haraway Road had been quietly demolished. The trafficking network that had been growing in the shadows of his territory was gone, dismantled piece by piece over the weeks that followed, each connection cut carefully, like pulling thread from cloth. Corso's name had stopped appearing anywhere, and an anonymous donation, processed through a clean legal foundation with no obvious origin, had funded housing and schooling for 19 people, including 2 children from a neighborhood near the fish market on Callum Road. Gideon heard through Brax that they were doing well. He didn't ask for more detail than that. On the shelf behind his desk at the Kellner Street office, between a legal binder and a dead phone he never replaced, sat a small picture frame. Simple dark wood. Nothing expensive. Inside was the folded piece of paper Teo had left for him that night at the compound. Unfolded, it showed a pencil drawing. The lines were crooked and the scale was completely wrong. But the image was unmistakable, a small figure standing outside a large dark car, one hand pressed flat against the glass. No words. Just the drawing. Gideon sat at his desk on Tuesday evening sometimes and looked at it without meaning to. He never told anyone what it meant to him that he didn't need to. Some things changed a man not with fire and noise, but with a child's hand pressed against cold glass, and a whisper that no one else heard.